Okay, well, why don't we go ahead and get started? Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. This session is being recorded, and we will share the recording as well as the presentation with everybody afterwards. We do want this to be an interactive session, so if you have any questions during the presentation, please pop them in the chat, and we'll make sure that John answers your questions for you, throughout the session. We appreciate everybody for joining today. So the session is steps for success for successful tech selection and implementation. And we want to welcome John Rotilla with OptiFunder. He is the Chief Revenue Officer with OptiFunder, and we appreciate you joining us today, John. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Mimi. I appreciate the invite, and thanks for everybody else for joining as well. It's a great topic and one that I hear people talk about a lot. Usually hear um, a lot of the downfall of tech selection and just some of the disappointment. I guess it's human nature to usually share those stories, but there are some things that um, I wanted to share just that I've learned not only in the last few years with OptiFunder, from implementations that we've done or feedback from clients and prospects for that matter, but just over the years with different tech implementations I've been involved with, and even fulfillment outsource solutions I've been involved with, because they seem to follow somewhat of a similar path. And I'd invite, we've got a half an hour here. I want this to be conversation. It's pretty high level. So if you've got questions, please, raise your hand electronically or whatever you do here. Click in, add a question in the chat, and we'll address it. So there's a few things that I'm going to review today. One, which is probably the most important piece, is to understand who you are as a company around how things happen, how decisions are made, how you're organizationally structured. It has a really big impact on whether tech will be successful or not, specifically through the implementation phase. So we're going to talk about understanding who you are as a company, and then really what's the impetus for making a change, or why automate certain tasks? Like, what's the decision-making process look like there? And again, it's often impacted to the positive or negative in how you're organized as the business. And then really, I want to share some things that, one, I think are really effective for a lender to ask their potential provider, and some that, maybe if there's other providers on the call here, maybe make you feel a little uncomfortable if I'm giving these suggestions, but you just need to get those out there, and your provider needs to give you these answers. So let's jump in. And again, we'll start with what I would consider, the most important piece here. So who are you as a company? And so I've put a few bullet points in here, but I've got some talking points as well. And really, it starts with, how does your company view technology? In other words, what's the importance of technology in your business? Do you view it as it's necessary, but you're typically slow to adopt because you're more of a boutique shop that really relies on personal communications, and you don't necessarily see the ultimate value in tech, and you don't lean on tech for your solutions? You're more of a people-oriented business. We have some of those, and really the success there is around the sheer amount of communication that goes on. And typically in some smaller shops where people wear a lot of hats, things can be solved for very quickly, just by open dialogue amongst teammates and members and supervisors and managers. That kind of dynamic usually works best in a smaller group. Also, do you look at tech as it being critical in your organization, but your typical view is always around the borrower experience, which I recognize, and it's not necessarily where we fit from a technology perspective, but I get it, having been in the business a long time. That's really the most important area, but it's not the only area that, in fact, that impacts the business overall from a cost perspective, et cetera. But do you typically focus solely on that, and maybe don't look at it as holistically across the entire business, as technology kind of lends itself in areas like accounting and post-closing and other areas that aren't necessarily borrower focused? Does that area get as much attention? And that kind of lends itself to those companies that take a very holistic view across all areas, and tech is reviewed on a regular basis, And much like a tech company, your view of that um, is constantly being updated with a technology roadmap that you have at the organization that's driven as a real high priority. And you are initiating tech objectives on a regular cadence just as a matter of strategy. It doesn't have to be all the time, but you have roadmap and you're keeping your eye on the ball of what technologies are out there, what you need to implement as a lender, and what it does for you. It's just a different mindset than the other two that I mentioned that view, what are we doing top of the funnel? Do we have the best CRM? And really those are the focuses. And then can we get this to closing quickly, right? And whatever those technologies are. The latter usually have a greater view of technology across the entire enterprise. And that has it's a much different approach than the other two. The other things that I've heard from lenders and I've read a little about as well, and I've heard from some other tech providers, is how are the processes and workflows that you have today, how are those determined? Do you take more of a linear view with specific task-based assignments, or are you task-centric? And do you have the right metrics behind that to measure how effective those things are? Or we see other groups that are more multifunction, kind of autonomous team approaches, typically kind of how I mentioned in that second level of tech review, kind of managed around the borrower experience. These oftentimes are kind of underwriter centered, right? Getting things into kind of the center of the hub. The underwriter plays quarterback on getting things approved and handing off and getting it closed at that point. I would kind of consider those as loan centric. And either one of those designs is effective in their own way. But really, how are those designs measured within your shop, and what metrics are used, and how loud are those successes and deficiencies being communicated and worked on as a matter of practice? What I see a lot of times is that there's a reliance from the top for the teams to provide that feedback on a regular basis. And so it's kind of taken as very matter of fact if things are working or not. So it's a different type of situation in each of those pieces. And it really kind of comes down to really how are all these decisions made to kind of put together your team and a little bit of your culture. How do those things manifest themselves? Is it really a top-down approach, and really leaders lead by example, and the culture that they manifest is what kind of runs through the organization? Is it a middle-out approach, which I kind of look at as departments kind of do their own thing and they kind of show who they are and their colors, and that's kind of the culture that they develop, and they're somewhat different than other areas, which can be fine as well? Or is it really bottom out or bottom up, which is each individual is kind of leaned on to be somewhat autonomous and a decision maker and kind of raise their hand and provide solutions, and that kind of bleeds its way up to the top, and then there's some ultimate decision on what gets done. That's a little bit more of a management by committee. So all of these things come into play when you're looking at technology, and how, when I look at it as a provider, how that lends itself to success, because there's all these different nuances, typically culturally, that kind of come into play, and how things may or may not be successful. So I think the self-awareness here for a lender here to understand who they are and how they represent themselves may impact the success. So if they know that if you are set up in a certain way, here are the 3 things you may need to look out for that may cause some hiccups in tech selection and implementation, versus someone else that has a different look. They may have a list of 3 that are different. But if you know who you are, then you know what to look for. I think that's very important. So, one of the questions I always ask when I'm talking to a prospect is, why are you looking to make a change? And, a lot of times it's automation. And why do you want to automate? And I kind of relate this back to a story in a job interview I had several years ago. And the CEO, as part of the conversation, was telling me, he said, hey, and, just to let you know, one of the things you're going to have to do when you come in is probably swap out our LOS. I know it's a big deal, but just want to let you know that's what everybody's asking for. And he says, what do you think about that? And I said, I don't know what to think about that. I hear what you're saying, and you're kind of saying that as a matter of fact, but with all due respect, what I'd like to do is come in and take a look and get the feedback and see what's going on here. What are you using? Where are the shortcomings? And is there really a reason to replace this, or just people just don't like it, and there may be other reasons why it's not working. It may not be the technology. There's often other things at play here. So let's surface those things first before we go down the path of trying to go buy something else. And so I would always make that same recommendation to lenders out there, because what I would also see is, hey, if you're just kicking something to the curb because you don't like it, the odds are there's going to be a point in time where you don't like what you bring on board either, for the same reasons. And I'll get into that a little bit as well here. The other thing is, when you're looking at your issues, are you trying to automate current processes, or are you open to creating new ones? I think that's super important. One is to consider is that your current process is built on the resources available today. And it may be a great process, but there may be some technology out there that can help you more so. Or there's some limitations in the current resources that the technology that's available today may free you up from. One thing I was reading the other day, and it really made the point, and this is a bit of a nuance here, and it said, technology is not a process. And I totally agree. And what they were saying on here, and I don't know if they got their point across very well, was don't rely on technology to dictate your process, because process is more of a cultural iteration, like I talked about earlier. But I would say that technology is a resource, and your processes are based on the resources that you have available. And technology as a new resource may be better. Therefore, your process may be better. So when you're looking at solving the problems that you're identifying, be open to a completely different process. It may take a little while to get used to, but just be open to the idea that you're not saying, can you automate this with these 10 steps that we had? Can you automate these 10 steps for us? Because my answer might be, I can get you from A to B, because that's really, or A to Z, because that's really your goal, but I'm not going to take the same path that you took to get there. I'm going to make a better one for you. So don't take the steps that you're going to go down and automate what you have today, because it may not be the same thing. And I think part of that issue really is, how have you identified the problem you're trying to solve, right? And there's a law out there. It's called Kydland's Law, and what it says is that any problem, when divided and examined in smaller, more manageable components, becomes half as complex and overwhelming, right? It just becomes easier. So as part of, and I talk about this too, as part of the preparation for talking to a vendor, is to really understand your problem. So if you are the champion of this solution, also be the champion of understanding this problem better than anybody else in your organization. You can rely on them for feedback, but you've got to be somewhat of an expert. And you can gain a lot of the information from your folks. But if you're an expert in what the problem is and you've really broken it down, you can understand better the value proposition of solutions as they're coming to you. So break it down big time, and that also helps you and prepares you for the conversations that you're going to have with your potential partner. So moving along here pretty quickly. So with all those things being said, right, I'll just recap a little bit, because I'm kind of shifting here to what you can talk to your providers about. One, how you're set up organizationally and who you are, how processes are managed and how you define them, who kind of makes the decisions and what gets done, and how you look at that kind of determines what your approach should be with dealing with a technology and defining your problem and how to solve for it, because implementing it will also take on a little bit of a different flavor for you depending on how you're set up. So there's a few things to look at here when you're talking to your provider, right? There's the usual things that you will ask, and there's maybe some of the unusual things that are super important. Certainly you want to get references, case studies, do demos if that's the type of solution you're looking at, so you can get really comfortable with that, and understand, the references you're going to get are going to be ones that are selected by the vendor, right? You're going to get feedback there, but they're 99 times out of 100, they're going to be positive. There may be some information in that you glean that's maybe you thought is a little different than what you were anticipating, which is fine. The case studies are going to be good examples of how the solution works for lenders, right? We wouldn't put out bad case studies if we had those. It's just not good marketing. I'm just being totally real here. So those are things you're going to get, but they're really great to glean some insights into how the solution worked for particular lenders and how it was managed and measured and its impact on their business. So you can read it for those purposes and maybe look at those first to get a little insight on how this has impacted lenders, and then talk to those references with that insight to say, how have you seen these things impact your business? And also multiple demos is important, specifically if there's a new technology out, like OptiFunder. Ours is a new technology in a new space. So doing one demo and then trying to make a decision, you probably don't really realize the entire value when then you're now looking at contracts. There's not an apples to apples comparison there. And also pull in the appropriate people that are going to give you real life feedback on these demos and how it may impact their daily lives or their departments, or what they feel about it from an accounting perspective or whatever area it may impact. The only caveat I would throw in there, and this is probably obvious as well, is that when bringing people on to demos, if you're not quite sure about the impact of the technology and what it means from an automation perspective and some of those things, that often there's a perception that technology replaces people. And that's never the angle that I take and at OptiFunder or elsewhere where I've been, because I think automation really is to replace the kind of the menial tasks, and it can elevate your people to do higher and better things in an organization. But the knee-jerk reaction from those folks that look at it and say, hey, what used to take me a couple hours or an hour to do can be reduced down to a couple clicks. What do they need me for? You may not get the feedback that you want. You may get the feedback that says, yeah, I don't know how well that'll work. It doesn't look like it's going to be that great. Here are the things I find fault with, right? You're probably not going to get, if there's 10 things to comment on, you're not going to get the 8 great things. You're going to get the 2 negative things, and they're going to hold off on the rest just out of self-preservation. So, that would be one of the things I would recommend. The other piece is, asking, can you test the system before deciding? And that's not always possible, but you should ask. Providers should go out of their way to try and give you some proof points prior to you having to make a decision. And frankly, it might make the decision easier, either way. We certainly do that at OptiFunder. We've built out a way that we can test a client's data against our system without having them have to buy the system or implement it. And it gives them another proof point using real data for them to say, hey, this should be helpful in making a decision. So always ask that. You never know what you'll be able to get from a vendor to say, hey, can I test it? Always makes sense. I always hear these stories around the value proposition of a lot of vendors is, if you implement our software, it's likely to do this, or maybe it'll generate more leads or something specific, focus on the customer side. But then you got to do something with all that stuff, right? It's not necessarily a means to an end. It's a hope, and there's a promise there made. But you really need to dial into what that means from a tangible perspective. I'd also say, set some really, really realistic expectations of the technology. It was never, whatever you're looking at, it was never meant to do anything. So make sure the boundaries are really well defined, and anticipate from your potential vendor that they're going to say no to things. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It means it's pretty focused, but if you've done your, and I'll go back to my example, if you've done your Kidlin's Law example and you've got your problem really well defined down into very tangible pieces, and you're asking if the tech can solve for these things, and there should be an inflection point where if you're not getting enough of what can be solved, it's probably not the tech for you. And that's okay. It wouldn't be a good fit for the tech either. But don't just on a hope and a whim and a prayer, hope that they can do more than what was initially anticipated. And I'd also be leery of those folks that say, we can probably do that. We can do that. It's okay to have some custom work in there, but just remember that it was built to do a certain thing. Everybody gets disappointed, not only through the implementation, because it usually takes longer and there's a lot of discovery and things that need to happen, but afterwards as well. If it doesn't quite, those fringe cases don't perform very well, you hang your head on the fringe cases and not on the 90% in the sweet spot that does really well. So have some really, really reasonable expectations on that. What you don't want to do is have conversations with the provider where at the end of the day, you've made all these requests and through that conversation, you're creating a new technology or a new software in the process, because that's just not what anybody anticipated. And that's, the provider should do a better job of reeling that in and keeping that conversation on point. Oftentimes, if you're having somebody, they're hopeful as well. Like, gosh, I hope my developers can solve for this. Let's get a little over our skis here and just let's see if this works out. We don't want to do that either on our end. It never works out to be a great solution. If you are making the decision to move ahead with the technology, it's the championing of that technology and solution within your organization probably doesn't get enough attention around how important that is. I've run into cases and I've heard from others and even from clients or prospects who've suggested this has been an issue in the past, that they'll have a top-down approach where a leader says, this is a great idea. I get it. I understand my problem. This solves for it. Let's do it. And you say, great. And they hand you off to a project manager, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But then kind of the message of this is what we're going to do gets a little lost. And then the challenge becomes sticking to a timeline, getting the deliverables in and keeping the interest up. And then after that, it always falls into, is the adoption there? Is the utilization there to make this a success? Because if you reflect on all those conversations that took place before, references, case studies, demos, all the questions, the proof points, recognizing that this solves your problem, you probably as a lender scratching your head and saying, what happened? This software is not what we thought it was. And that isn't always the answer. I suppose it could be, but it isn't always the answer. You have to look at, did we drop the ball from an adoption utilization perspective? Did we not get the message all the way through to the group to evangelize on the fact that this is going to make things better for our company and we need the buy-in? And did you earn buy-in with your team that they're all on board with that solution? They've locked arms, they're marching in lockstep. We at OptiFunder, when we see that, it makes it really hard to have a successful implementation and then go live launch and thereafter. But when we do have folks lock arms and their management does a great job explaining the strategy and why this is important to the organization and why everyone benefits, we've had implementations that go through amazingly smoothly. I mean, just because of that point, they can be as sophisticated as others, and we've done them in half or a third the time as some others. No other difference except for that level of communication and buy-in throughout the lender from their leadership. It's absolutely amazing. The other thing that I would suggest is make sure that the mutual timelines around your implementation plan aren't just something you see on an SOW and you sign off on. It should be something you really sit down and talk about and really get in there with a fine tooth comb and say, we really want to understand what you need and why perhaps, and what does that mean if we can't get these to you by now? What other dependencies are we slowing down? And you don't want to be at a point and say, well, it only took me an extra week to get you these pieces of information. Now, why are we 4 weeks off? And it could be, well, these dependencies would kick off 4 different things that we're working on our end. Now they're all delayed. So understand the the implications of your implementation timeline in the dependencies. Just makes clear communication and understanding go forward, because the last thing anybody wants to do, specifically providers, create a bad experience through implementation that just sets the tone incorrectly. So those mutual timelines is really important, and keeping a champion on board at your shop to make sure that this is carried through, not only through implementation, but at the go live stage. What are you doing to maintain that adoption and utilization and ensure that, there's metrics in place to measure for those things? I think those are the really key items here, post decision, and how to keep these things on the rails and make them successful for everybody. So it looks like we're bumping up against time. I didn't think I could talk so much on these subjects, but I will pause there and say thank you for the time. And if there's any questions, sure, let's fire away. If
Those
not,
were really applicable points, John. Thank you for sharing that.
sure, Mimi, thank you.
Does anybody have any questions for John? Well, you must have done a really good job covering all your points. So
Hope so. Hope that was
absolutely.
worth everybody's while. I appreciate everybody joining and allowing me to share some thoughts. Appreciate it.
Thank you, John. We appreciate your time. We will be sharing the recording and the presentation with everybody. If you have any questions for John, please feel free to reach out. I'm happy to connect you guys. Thanks, everybody. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.